Great. Thank you, everyone. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily. I am the chair at the Democrats Abroad Global Asian American and Pacific Islander Caucus, the Democrats Abroad AAPI Caucus. Thank you all for joining us today and for attending this event. Just to give you a quick little background about our caucus, we are focused on reaching out to AAPI voters living abroad and others interested in AAPI issues and culture, as well as increasing engagement in civic, cultural, and political life, and advocating for laws, policies, and programs that improve the lives of Asian Americans and Pacific Islander people. We are really honored today to have Kyle Van Fleet, Strategic Communications Associate with APIAVote, with us today. APIAVote, for those of you who haven't heard of them before, has been at the forefront of a rising movement to ensure AAPIs are represented and heard, leading us to historic voter turnout and advancing equity for AAPI communities. We were very fortunate last year to have APIAVote's founding executive director, Christine Chen, speak with us regarding voting in the AAPI community. And if you're interested, you can watch the recording of that event on our YouTube page. I will throw that link in the chat for anyone interested. Highly recommend you watch that. It was a really great event. One of the major initiatives of APIAVote is monitoring disinformation and misinformation. Harmful narratives, including mis and disinformation, are one of the greatest challenges facing AAPI communities in today's world. They are making communities less safe and trust in the election systems weaker. It is even tearing some families apart. To make matters worse, the issue of harmful narratives is often overlooked as it pertains to AAPI spaces, leaving AAPI communities at greater risk. Kyle leads APIAVote's program for monitoring and combating mis and disinformation regarding democracy, elections, and harmful narratives impacting or originating from AAPI communities. Kyle will discuss today different forms of disinformation, how the ecosystem of disinformation works, how disinformation looks different for AAPIs, and what are some ways to combat it. After his presentation today, there will be a discussion of how we can assist our communities in combating this problem as we head into the midterm elections in November. There are also a few reports that you might be interested in reading. APIAVote Guide to Confronting Disinformation was actually written by Kyle, which you can find here on their website. And there's also another report, Power, Platforms, and Politics, Asian Americans and Disinformation, which is a report from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, and Kyle is a co-author of this report. So both recommend that you check that out. And before we get started, just speaking of midterm elections, this is a reminder to everyone that the elections are coming up in a few weeks. They are less than a month away, and it is crucial to our communities and for the future of democracy and human rights in America that you vote. Please make sure that you vote in these elections. For more information on voting from abroad, you can go to votefromabroad.org. Please know that you should have already requested your ballot. If you haven't, you can go to the website to do that. If you requested your ballot, I also hope that you've received it by now. States are required to start sending out ballots 45 days in advance, and we are well past that now. If you haven't received anything recently, either in your email or your actual mailbox, please reach out to your local election officials now to find out where your ballot is. You can find their contact information or submit an assistance request also on the votefromabroad.org website. So please take care of that today if you haven't already. Now, before I hand it over, I'd like to introduce you to Kyle. Kyle, as I mentioned, is the Strategic Communications Associate at APIAVote, where he leads the organization's efforts to monitor mis and disinformation regarding democracy, elections, and harmful narratives impacting or originating from AAPI communities. Kyle also manages APIAVote's social media strategy and supports the organization's overall work on narrative change, among other things. Prior to joining APIAVote, Kyle worked as a digital research associate monitoring mis and disinformation at GQR during the 2020 election cycle. Kyle is a graduate of James Madison University and is an accomplished professional photographer. Please join me in welcoming Kyle, and Kyle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see it? Are we good?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, hey, everyone. My name is Kyle Van Fleet. I am the Communications Associate, as Emily said, at Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. We are the nation's leading nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to engaging, educating, and empowering AAPI communities to strengthen their voice and create impact. I wear many hats in this role as communications associate, but as mentioned by Emily, one of them includes monitoring disinformation. The main narratives that we monitor for are issues related to democracy and elections, as well as harmful narratives impacting or originating from AAPI communities. So with this presentation, the first thing I'll do is kind of give a backgrounder on what disinformation is and how it's a unique problem for AAPI communities. And then we can talk about ways on how to combat it as individuals as well as organizations. So hold on. So one thing I want to say, like before we go deep into this presentation, is I say AAPI spaces. I use that term. What I mean by that is groups, social media platforms, just places on the internet where you're more likely to find Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders gathering. I do want to specify that I did include Pacific Islanders in here. This is based on conversations with our Pacific Islander partners who say a lot of the same narratives that Asian Americans are exposed to, Pacific Islanders are as well. But it is important to note that there really isn't any research on narratives that are specifically targeting Pacific Islanders and how disinformation specifically impacts Pacific Islander communities specifically. So while I will be using the term AAPI spaces throughout this presentation, do know that there is a bit of nuance when I say that, and there's more information and research about how disinformation targets Asian Americans specifically. So first thing, let's just get some definitions out of the way, right? So when we talk about disinformation, it's often used as a generic term to talk about various forms of problematic narratives. But there are some important distinctions that I think are important to make before we go forward. I will say I'm definitely guilty of using disinformation to describe all of this, but that doesn't necessarily mean every single thing is quote unquote disinformation. So first, disinformation can be defined as false information deliberately created or disseminated with the express purpose to cause harm. So one recent example of this is something called #ChinaCoop. This happened a couple weeks ago. I don't know if any of you heard about it, but essentially this online trend claimed that President Xi Jinping of China was being ousted and was under house arrest, and unfortunately, this just wasn't true whatsoever. And unfortunately, some media outlets, specifically in India, reported it as true. There was nothing to back it up, and that's a perfect example of disinformation, right? Misinformation is information that is false but not intended to cause harm. This might be more like your aunt posting about a cure to COVID-19 on her Facebook that she has not fact-checked. Malinformation is truthful information that is decontextualized and misrepresented in order to cause harm. A good example of this, especially in the last 2 years, is this idea of the quote unquote Black on Asian crime trope. Essentially, it's this narrative that can be found online that anti-Asian hate crimes are actually largely perpetuated by Black folks, even though that's not true. We know it 75% of those perpetrators tend to be white. But by taking isolated examples of where a Black person attacks an Asian person, whether it was racially motivated or just a crime of opportunity, being able to take those isolated examples and paint a story, that's malinformation because it's based on something sort of true, but it's being decontextualized and misused. And then very lastly, kind of an umbrella term, just problematic narrative. These are narratives that have the potential to cause harm. I think I like using this term a lot more because it doesn't just include, false information. It could also include stuff that's racist or homophobic, right? So things that just have the ability to cause harm. So when discussing disinformation, bad actors in Russia are who usually come to mind, but this is only a fraction of the story. The truth is there is a significant portion of disinformation in the United States that just has domestic origins. Disinformation is a well-funded industry that ranges from hyperpartisan news outlets masquerading as unbiased local media to bot accounts manipulating dialogue on social media platforms to the organic promotion of extremist voices without consequence by social media companies. It may also originate from ordinary users like you and I, even though I would like to think you and I would not be the ones spreading this type of stuff, as well as who just people who may not be knowing the consequences of their actions, but by sharing it, problematic narratives are able to spread through the communities they are a part of. I do want to kind of go through this real quick. So when I say industry, it includes, again, like media outlets such as, Daily Caller or the Daily Wire, maybe you've heard of those, or the Epoch Times. There's also like kind of a shadow business, something called troll farms, where people's jobs are literally dedicated to creating bots and pushing out whatever narrative they're being paid to, and then elected officials, public figures, influencers, and micro influencers. And for those who may not know, micro influencers are essentially the same thing as an influencer, but it's in either a niche topic or only in their town or state. And then again, as I said, everyday people do unfortunately play a role in this. Even though I said all of this about domestic actors, I do want to just kind of quickly mention that foreign countries do play a role in launching disinformation campaigns in the United States. Of course, we have obvious evidence that Russia played a role in 2016 and 2020, and they continue to. It's not just in the United States, it's in France and all these other countries, right? And the same is true with China and Vietnam. The difference between these is that Russia is more interested in dividing the American population, while China and Vietnam are more interested in turning their worldview into something more popular among the American people. So I just want to quickly just give some examples, just so you can kind of put a face to what I'm talking about. So here I have an example of a politician, a celebrity, a professional provocateur, a problematic outlet, and an in-language disseminator. Just so you can quickly learn who some of these people are. In the top left, it is State Senator Wendy Rogers. I heard there's a couple of you all who are from Arizona, so maybe you've heard of her. She's a big proponent of the big lie, maybe one of the most radical of them. But obviously, she's able to use her platform as a politician to get her message out. Up below that is the Epoch Times, which is to put it nicely, a shady outlet that has been translated into tens of different languages, and they have a very, very wide reach. But they spread a lot of like election denial narratives, as well as just a bunch of other very far right narratives that are not always based in truth, right? The next one we have is Andy Ngo, who is a professional provocateur. Some might call him a journalist, but essentially he's a very big proponent of this Black on Nation crime trope, which I mentioned earlier, and he uses his social media platform to spread mis and disinformation as well as hate speech. The next one there, it's a guy named Cao Chongqing, who we would probably consider a micro influencer because he's really only well known in the Chinese speaking diaspora. And then very lastly, and I know maybe some of you may know who this is, a rapper, Nicki Minaj, who I believe last year tweeted something related to COVID-19 that just was not true whatsoever. And even though she probably did not mean to spread mis and disinformation, it's an example of, because of the fact that she has millions of fans and followers, that her tweeting something about it was able to get very far, very fast, right? And then just a couple examples here on the right. There's something to say about suspicious accounts and bots who play a role in spreading disinformation, right? So on the very far right, it's an example of a suspicious account. We can't verify it's a real person. Its name is Pebbles Flintstone, and its photo is a dog, right? So there's really no way to really figure out if this is a genuine person or where this person's video came from. But in this video, it essentially shows someone trying to vote in California on a voting machine, but not letting them vote Republican. We cannot verify this video, nor do we really know the origins of it, but it was able to gather at least 30,000 some views. And that's just an example of a suspicious account playing a role in this. And then if you look to your left, I know it's very small, so I'll explain it to you. Essentially, in a local Facebook group in New Jersey after the 2021 election, there was some delays in one particular county. There was a unbiased news article talking about it, and someone shared it and said that, oh, obviously something's going on, fraudulent. That's fraudulent, right? And even though this is just a very small group, because this represents a community of folks in New Jersey, this is an example of how disinformation can spread locally just by an ordinary person, even if they realize what they're doing or not. So wherever the disinformation may be coming from or whoever's spreading it, the question at hand is, what makes the issue of disinformation in AAPI spaces different? So firstly, we are spread across so many different platforms, often in language, in comparison to other demographics. So some of these include WhatsApp, WeChat, Weibo, Viber, which many APIs use as their main source of news. Since we are so spread out, it makes it very difficult to effectively track the wide variety of narratives that may be disseminating. This issue is also compounded by the fact that these platforms heavily utilize private closed spaces, right? And since these platforms also often have little to no infrastructure to combat disinformation and face less public scrutiny in comparison to apps such as Facebook to do anything about it, it just creates an even bigger problem. Even mainstream platforms such as Facebook or Twitter, which, AAPIs, of course, are also on, already have weak policies regarding disinformation and are inconsistent with enforcing said policies. So the truth is, most social media platforms, whether it's Facebook or WeChat, are just not doing enough to combat disinformation. And to make matters worse, the API communities encompass over 50 languages, over 50 different ethnic groups. And even if you hypothetically could speak or understand all these different languages, you also have to understand the cultural context. And it's also important to note that, the slang or terminology that Chinese Americans might use might not be the same as those who recently immigrated from China, right? So there's a lot of manpower that's involved in completely understanding how disinformation makes sense to each different group. And also, one very last note on this page is that platforms are also less likely to flag disinformation in foreign languages. There's not necessarily research to show that it doesn't get flagged as much in Chinese or other languages, but we do know that it isn't getting flagged in Spanish. And Spanish is being the second most spoken language in the United States. If it's bad with Spanish and already bad with English, you can only imagine how bad it is with less widely used languages such as Mandarin and Japanese, etc. So quickly, I just want to go over some of the common themes that you can find about AAPI communities, and then I'll discuss some of the narratives that are spreading within AAPI communities. So again, APIs are not only exposed to disinformation, but they are increasingly the subject of disinformation as well, right? So this is especially true for Asian Americans. This is a double whammy of sorts that our communities face, and these types of narratives often include things such as non-people of color placing blame for anti-Asian hate crimes or other societal woes on Black and Latino communities to pit our communities against each other, placing blame for COVID-19 on Asian Americans, particularly Chinese, claiming an Asian American, particularly Chinese, again, are not truly American and are in fact loyal to the Chinese government. And then, of course, claiming an Asian American is a communist. So these are just some of the common narratives that Asian Americans and to a lesser extent Pacific Islanders have to face, and that is obviously very difficult when there's already so much disinformation spreading within our communities already. It appears my slide listing all the issues that that are spreading within spreading in API communities is missing for some reason. So I'm just going to freeball this. So some of the main narratives that we can find in API spaces include things, COVID-19 misinformation, things about the big lie, election fraud and anything related to democracy. You can definitely find that in API spaces. You also find a lot of stuff about disaggregated data. For those who may not know what that is, essentially it's the idea that because we use the term Asian American and Pacific Islander, it doesn't tell the whole story of what each community within our large, larger community go through. And some people see efforts to disaggregate data as racist towards themselves, which personally to me doesn't make any sense. But because of that, there is a lot of disinformation among certain groups that disaggregated data is a really bad thing. On top of that, we have, stuff that's anti-affirmative action. We have this Black on Asian crime trope, as I mentioned, and those are some of the biggest ones that we're seeing. Of course, there's disinformation about a lot of other different topics. One other thing I will mention is you see a lot of misleading anti-communist and anti-socialist narratives, and these types of things often appeal to certain communities, right, who may have had experiences with an authoritarian government, especially Chinese and Vietnamese folks. So again, those are just some of the main narratives that are spreading within AAPI communities. I apologize, I'm not sure what happened to my slide listing them. And then before I move on, I just want to mention that we've talked a lot about social media, right? But it isn't only social media, it's also radio and newspaper, especially for our folks who are over 60. And it's because there's such already like a journalism desert, a media desert going on in this country already, but especially for in language, it's an even bigger problem because ethnic media is, there are a lot of great outlets, but there's also not enough, right? And so because of that, it's often when we talk about disinformation, it's not always actually the issue of disinformation. It's the fact that there just isn't any information for folks to read at all. So bad actors are able to take advantage of that and fill up that vacuum with really, really bad stuff. And that's how oftentimes they're able to spread their message. So again, while we're mostly talking about social media here, it is important to note that it isn't only social media. So now I'm going to go ahead and talk about ways that we can combat disinformation as an organization or as an individual in your own personal social media feeds. So if there's anything that you learned from this presentation today, it's that you should not engage with problematic posts. And I'll say that one more time, do not directly engage with problematic posts. Engaging with a problematic post, whether it's positive or negative, gives the post a wider audience due to the way algorithms work, right? So there are very few instances where directly engaging with disinformation is actually constructive. The only time that you should ever engage, oh, sorry, 1 second. My alarm went off. This is usually when I wake up. Yeah, so do not engage with problematic posts. And that leads me to my next point, which is a response necessary? The only time that you should ever engage with something problematic is if it's already gone super viral and the mainstream media is talking about it. It's a mainstream conversation, or it causes an immediate threat to you or your organization, right? So beyond that, there really shouldn't be often a time where you're directly engaging and responding to these posts, right? And then my next thing is, if we are going to respond, it shouldn't be necessarily directly, it should be through inoculation. And what I mean by this quickly is that instead of acknowledging the bad information, it should be about actually only pushing out good information, putting out that good narrative, and making sure people are seeing it, which again leads me to my next point, that you got to repeat. If you think you've been annoying about something, you're probably still not doing enough, right? So one of the most important ways as an organization is you continue putting out that messaging that can inoculate voters. So when they do see bad information, they're like, oh, but I saw this other thing. You're giving them critical thinking skills essentially through this. Another tactic, again, is using trusted messengers. Oftentimes your organization is viewed as a trusted messenger, and you really are the person or group that people look up to. So you need to use that platform responsibly and make sure you're getting things like when what your voting rights are in a certain state are, what the deadlines are, things like that. But it's also important to know that you are not the only trusted messenger. And it's important to work with people in the community who may have more direct contact with those who need to be contacted the most. This might be, pastors, right? This might be small business owners. This might be local micro influencers, right? A couple other tactics to combating disinfo as an organization. This one you probably would not be using too much as an organization, but I like to put it out there as undermining bad actors' legitimacy. Sometimes, we just talked about trusted messengers, and, sometimes someone really trusts someone, but if you're able to kind of like cut off that trust by explaining why this person is, a bad actor, why they're untrustworthy, they have a history of lying, XYZ, or, they're doing it for the money. If you're able to erode that trust with whoever the bad actor is, that's another effective way of combating disinformation, especially if it's a person who consistently puts it out. In any disinformation effort that you have, you should always make sure it's in language and culturally competent to whoever you're trying to reach. If you represent or you mostly work with Chinese Americans, for instance, and it would be very smart to have these efforts be in Mandarin, right? And then the most simple one of all is you can always just report a post. Again, as I mentioned earlier, social media companies are not necessarily great at enforcing their own policies. However, it doesn't hurt to try to report something. And this next one, truth sandwich, I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is an effective messaging strategy that's used to combat problematic narratives. Essentially, the truth sandwich says you start with the truth, you acknowledge the problem, and then you end with the truth. So I'll go ahead and give you an example, right? The first truth: anti-Asian hate has long been an issue for the Asian American community, but has been intensified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Some have been using this issue to wedge a divide between Asian Americans and other communities of color by blaming these attacks on them. The truth is, we know it is white supremacy driving many of these anti-Asian attacks, as well as attacks against other communities. By coming together, we are louder, we are stronger, and we can make the change to protect all Americans, regardless of their identity. So you are acknowledging that the Black on Asian crime trope is a thing, but the idea of the truth sandwich is that people are more likely to remember the first thing and the last thing that they hear, right? So you're quickly putting that you're acknowledging that problem in the middle, but you're leaving people with the memory that anti-Asian hate has been intensified by the pandemic, and that we need to come together to protect all Americans, regardless of their identity, from whatever hateful attacks. So truth sandwich, one of the most important lessons I think I can give you today for messaging on how to combat disinformation. And I know this is under combating disinfo as an org, but definitely think this is something you can use as an individual as well. And so I'll end this presentation with just a couple tips on combating disinfo in your own personal life, whether you're with an organization or not. So when you see disinformation or something problematic, there's two questions you should ask yourself. How well do you know the topic? Maybe you think something isn't right, or you think something is false, but if you don't know more than the person posting it, then you got to do that research first, right? Or at the very least, say what's your source, or what where are you hearing that from, or how, what's your evidence, right? And so you can at least have that person think twice about what they're putting out there, but you should definitely not talk about something absolutely without actually knowing whether or not that is true or false, right? And then you should also always ask yourself if this person is responsive to feedback and other perspectives. You got to know which battles to fight. If someone is very argumentative, that is not the type of person you should be focusing on. You should be focusing on those who are receptive to others. And I would like to mention, and this goes with the other tips I've written down, don't do this publicly. You should always, if it's online, private message them. If this is in person, pull them aside, maybe not necessarily even that same day if you're in a group setting. But, of course, it's important to have those tough conversations. And when you do have these conversations, you should always approach them with empathy and understanding. Some people, are just not realizing what they're doing, and or this is an issue that is very important to them. And so you want to make sure that they know that you're not there to attack them, but you're there to have a healthy, constructive conversation. And again, if this person becomes argumentative or, hateful, know when to disengage. And then very lastly, my last suggestion is, to be a resource, whether that's, saying, let's look this up together. Let's see if this is a disinformation or not, or whether it's sharing anything I've shared in these slides about the danger of disinfo and how people do it for money, etc. So that's my presentation. If you all are interested in getting involved, APIAVote creates biweekly reports on the main trends that we're seeing in a 2-week period. If you want to send me your email or just email me and tell me your interest at media@apiavote.org, definitely feel free to let me know. We have biweekly calls for each of these reports as well. On these calls, we talk about, what we're seeing, and I try to make sure that I have eyes as in many places as I can to make sure I'm capturing everything. Building on that, if you would like to help us monitor, definitely let us know. That's my email at media@apiavote.org, and I'm sure it'll be sent to you all after this. So that's my presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Kyle. That was really interesting, and I'm sure we'll have some questions coming in. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat, star hand up. But I will go ahead and get started with the question that we had. So as you discussed, researchers have noted that AAPI people believe disinformation claims because they trust the source of the claims. So the importance of trust in the AAPI communities plays a key role in how information is accessed, communicated, and believed. And mistrust in the voting process has led to the widespread use of targeted disinformation by Republicans. We had an event with Sungyeon Choi Morrow a while back. She's the executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. And she noted in her presentation that she talked about the Auntie network that they're building for outreach to help combat dis and misinformation. So I was just wondering if you can suggest other ways we can contribute to combating targeted disinformation campaigns, or if that's something that APIAVote is also looking into.
Yeah, of course. So a lot of it is kind of like stuff that I said earlier, that it's important that, first and foremost, to have these difficult conversations with those in your circles, right? Because I think oftentimes we talk about, as you mentioned, trusted messengers, but actually, you and I, everyone here, in a sense, is a trusted messenger with those that know us and trust us, right? And so I would say, having those hard conversations, first of all, in your own personal life is step one. But moving on from that, kind of, as you said, with the Auntie network, I think that's a great example. There's other, different kinds of networks that we can utilize, right? Whether if it's at a church, maybe it's with the pastor. If it's a community center, maybe there's local community leaders, or there's small business owners that in a community that people really trust. I know there was one story someone shared with me that somewhere in California there's a Chinese American woman whose job is to kind of buy groceries for people and then drop them off for whatever reason. And she would use those interactions with her customers to talk about, the importance of getting the COVID-19 vaccine, right? Saying it's safe, like, it's the important thing to do for our community. With a lot of the customers who may not have necessarily been interested, or they were nervous about the vaccine, right? So that's just another example of just, how locally, like, someone can have an impact. But I do think it's important to know that, as organizations or, whatever your platform is, it all comes down to, pushing out good information just as hard as the others do, and to make sure that you are putting it out consistently, and that it's getting to people before the others do, right? So there's a lot of different networks that can be used, and the answer is to use each and every single one you can.
Another one thing I was wondering, maybe you've APIAVote's looked into this, but like looking specifically at this narrative that's already building about like the elections are rigged, or like whatever happens, it's just you can't trust the results. I don't know if you have any information on like how that's specifically impacting the AAPI community, or if people, that's something that a lot of AAPI are believing and then choosing then to say like, I'm not going to vote because you can't trust it, or yeah, just anything on that.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to say is it's not that it's definitely impacting AAPIs, right? I would also say that a lot of this is being talked at the national level, and it just comes down and it's being translated, and it's definitely a big problem. However, that I think Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, according to our Asian American voter survey, are still very motivated to vote. I believe it's over 2/3 of Asian Americans say they're very likely to vote this upcoming election. So that's not to say that it's completely dampering our community and our willingness to go out to vote, but of course it's impacting a good number. I think it's a little bit less about convincing people not to vote as much as it is about election fraud this time around. That's what we're seeing a lot this year. And the way that we're, going about it is pushing out, social media campaigns of why it's important to vote, why your vote and voice matters. And also just talking about like simple things such as deadlines, your voting rights and such, because at the end of the day, again, as I said earlier, it's all about putting out that good information and also messaging that will convince and encourage folks to get out and vote despite whatever BS is spreading around. I saw someone put their hand up. I don't know if.
Yeah, Corey, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. I'm curious. I'm still kind of formulating the question, but I'm wondering if you if you've noticed, is it pretty consistent across each language group, or does there tend to be like more misinformation, disinformation, whatever, in different groups? Do you notice those trends? Have you seen that, or is it pretty consistent?
Yeah, so I guess I would say two things. The first thing is, just because I said earlier with the capacity, it's very difficult to know the full breadth of like everything being said. But I do feel just via observation that I'm more likely to see disinfo in Mandarin or an Indian language, Hindi or something more. I think oftentimes that might be because of the fact that they have a larger population here in the US versus, Japanese. And then to your second or my second point is that a lot of the narratives are pretty consistent. As I said, like a lot of the times it's national stuff just like trickling down and being translated. But I do think it's important to note that, again, some narratives are more likely to be relevant to other groups more than others. With Indian American diaspora, we see kind of this growing issue of Hindu nationalism, and a lot of that stems back from the home country of India itself and the conversations and narratives that are being talked about there. And then, again, with stuff that's like misleading communist or socialist stuff, we see that more likely to spread in Vietnamese or Chinese communities, obviously because they come from authoritarian governments that subscribe to communism and socialism, right? So I guess to answer your question, a lot of it is consistent, but there's definitely some differences, and it's difficult to know that exactly how much disinformation is being spread in each different language, but I think it's often reflected by how large that population might be and how much that they're targeted. Hopefully that makes sense.
That makes sense. And just as a follow-up question to that,
Yeah.
even like it's really interesting. I find it very fascinating that it's coming from the top down and just being translated and things into the, is there any sort of bottom up? Do we see any sort of like misinformation from, what did you call them, micro influencers or whatever? Is that in AAPI groups going upwards or anything like that? Or is it still very, I don't know if you, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely understand your question. It's a really good question. And I think that definitely does happen. But I think when it, like, for instance, let's say it's a Chinese American micro influencer and it's able to get picked up, I think it's important to note that it is probably less likely to get out of that specific space because it probably already is in Mandarin and really probably only is appealing to Chinese Americans in whatever spaces they're in, right? So I think it definitely does happen bottom up, but it isn't, how do I explain? It's not probably going to spread much further
As, yeah,
most of the
nationally or
time.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
if that makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
of course.
Susan, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Kyle. That was really amazing. And I went to the one that you did last year. And it's interesting because I can't remember her name, but one of the people that was on the group with you was from Orange County.
Yeah.
And she was talking about, that very conservative group of voters that are in Orange County. And with redistricting now, there's two really key elections that border on parts of Orange County. And in this thing that Karen was mentioning it, before we started, there was Jay Chen, who's running in one of those districts, has had this incredible, it's shocking to me, misinformation campaign directed at him from his Republican counterpart. And she basically took and doctored a picture of him and wrote in with it writing in Mandarin, pointing out that he was a communist, translated it into Vietnamese and put it into a brochure, and then put it into the Vietnamese community. And they've had to spend thousands of dollars to combat that. And I know that, and that's also true with the other one in that whole area. But I know APIAVote does a lot with getting the word out to various communities in languages. Are you doing something specific to deal with disinformation so that they can, combat this? Here they get this, the guy's a communist. If you vote Democrat, we're going to be left. Joe Biden is a communist, those type of things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, sorry, did you have more?
No, that's it.
Oh,
thank you.
Okay. Sorry. I didn't know if I interrupted you. So as a nonpartisan organization, we don't really get involved like in specific races and the issues of those races. Obviously, I'm aware of what has been said about Jay Chen, and unfortunately, this is not the only example of an Asian American who, again, is being dubbed as a communist because the other side just doesn't like their policies. But in terms of actually, still combating disinformation, we're obviously very involved in that. And we, through our monitoring, we, let our partners know, including in Southern California, in Orange County, that, these things are being spread. And even though we don't necessarily get involved in these campaigns or we don't necessarily respond to every single instance of this, we do provide messaging and the awareness of this stuff to our local partners. So they're the ones who are, on the ground in whatever place of this country. And we believe that oftentimes they might be better to respond to their local races or their local issues. But that said, we still have national social media campaigns pushing out stuff more generally about, voting early is safe, or whatever more issues related to that, more or less. Hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, we definitely are in contact with local partners in Orange County and help provide messaging to combat disinformation.
Thank you.
Of course.
I'll just jump in there kind of to go off of that question. I don't know if you then have you noticed certain, trends in the type of disinformation that's been coming out this election cycle versus the 2020 election cycle? Have things changed at all, or is it still pretty much the generally same narratives that are being pushed?
Yeah, no, of course. There is definitely a lot of the same stuff in 2020. I'll say that first and foremost, but I think the biggest difference is there is so much preemptive claims of voter fraud or election fraud or whatever kind of election tampering. I think I read somewhere about 2/3 of Americans have an election denier on their ballot this year. And so, and a lot of those folks, including, I know some of you are from Arizona, the gubernatorial candidate for Arizona has specifically made these preemptive calls already. And of course, that's very problematic and dangerous. So that's definitely one of the biggest things that we're seeing in 2022. A couple other things that we're seeing, include, stuff about critical race theory, that even though that was more of probably of a conversation last year, it hasn't completely gone away. The Black on Asian crime trope, we definitely saw some of that in 2020, but it continues to be an issue, more so than, probably the 2016 election. Those are just some examples of things that I think are very different. But of course, you still have stuff that's like vote by mail is not safe. It's a way to rig elections. You still see stuff about election machines. And you still see, misleading anti-communist and socialist narratives. But again, there's definitely some differences in 2022.
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting to see kind of how this evolves, and especially, how over time things change with social media and all these different platforms, because there's just more and more platforms and more ways for things to spread. And like you said, it's hard to just keep track of all of these to even know what's going on. Karen, you've got a question.
Actually, I do, and it's based on Susan's question about the Orange County election, but it's not specifically about that. We have seen this year a lot more Republican candidates who are people of color, who are Asians, African Americans, and other minorities. One of the things that we've seen a lot of in California, which I personally found absolutely horrifying, is sort of the Asian on Asian hate that, people are saying, oh, he's Vietnamese, oh, that she's Korean, oh, he's Chinese. And then they say all the things that, you've heard at some point at your family table where somebody said, well, you can't trust the Japanese. They invaded us in 42. Or things like, oh, he's Vietnamese. It's impossible to know what they're actually thinking. We're better than they are. I've seen a lot of that actually in some of the political advertising that specifically in Orange County, but also elsewhere. Does APIAVote, have you guys seen this? Do you have specific ideas about this, or does this also fall under your sort of notification of your local team?
Yeah, so we're definitely in communication with our local partners about these types of things. It's interesting. I definitely seen some of that, but I don't know if I've necessarily seen that play out on social media as much as I've seen it in, political campaigning and advertising. So I would definitely love to talk more after this and see more of what you're hearing about. But yeah, this would definitely be something, we talk with our local partners about. They make us aware of it, and or if we're seeing something nationally, vice versa. But I think, the important thing to remember with this is that we have to continue, reminding everyone that, we're, stronger together, right? We have so many shared values, and we, share a future. And if we want to, and I think a lot of that aligns, right? We want equality. We want, society that allows Asian American Pacific Islanders to, achieve, their full potential. And so putting out that messaging, in light of what you just mentioned, continues to be one of APIAVote's, foremost priorities in messaging.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think just for the sake of time, I'm sure, Kyle, you need to get your day started officially. And some of us may need to go back to our jobs or whatever is going on wherever we are in the world, or go to bed. So I want to go ahead and just wrap up and say thank you so much for being here today, for getting up early and sharing this information with us. And thank you to everyone that joined today. Really appreciated hearing what you're working on and hearing what APIAVote's doing. And I think it's a really important issue that we're going to be stuck with for quite some time. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Karen for your IT support today. And thank you to Susan Takao, who helped organize this event. She's a member of our steering committee. So thank you, both of you, for your help. And thank you to everybody who joined today. I think those that are on the call are well aware, but if you are an overseas American and not yet a member of Democrats Abroad, you should consider joining. And then you can become a member of our caucus. All you have to do is just go to democratsabroad.org/join to join. It doesn't cost anything. It's very easy, simple, fast. You should do that. We also are always looking for volunteers. If you want to get involved, there's a really easy way to do it, especially right now. You can help us phone bank. We are calling all of our members who are registered Democrats living abroad, and we want to reach them to make sure that they know that they can vote and that they get the help that they need to do so. People we reach when we phone bank are more likely to vote, and we need to reach as many of them as possible in the last few weeks. So if you are interested in learning more about phone banking, you can go to our website, do some training. It's really easy. Everyone's very appreciative of the call because they're not getting the usual barrage of calls that those in the US are getting. So please take a look at that. We also have a list of things that you can do to help us get out the vote. We have 10 actions to take now to help elect Democrats in November. So you can also check out this lovely slide that we've put together for things to do. And again, of course, none of this would be possible without financial support. I know that it's not something everybody enjoys, but if you have the financial means to help us out right now, every cent will help make sure that we can carry out all of our work that we're doing and make those phone calls. So with that, please make sure you vote. Please make sure you have your ballot. If you don't have it yet, go to votefromabroad.org right now that this call is over. Thank you to everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you at a future event, and happy voting. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kyle.